Hello everyone, I'm going to start reading chapter 1 of The Hatchet by Gary Paulson, a survival story about a boy named Brian who was caught, trapped, and lost in the Canadian wilderness. I hope that you enjoy this. There are going to be 2 videos for chapter 1, part 1 and part 2, and 2 videos for chapter 2. Part 1 and part 2. So please make sure that you watch all of the videos before you do your week 5 journal and question response on Friday of week 5. Enjoy the book. Chapter 1. Brian Robson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud, that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13 and the only passenger on the plane with a pilot named, what was it, Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he prepared for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York, to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had spoken only 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot seat, which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all the controls right there in front of him, all of the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, moving sideways and taking off. But in 5 minutes, they'd leveled off at 6,000 feet and headed northwest. From then on, it had been pretty much silent. Brian looked out the horizon spread with lakes, swamps, streams, and rivers. Now Brian sat, staring out the window with the roaring thundering through his ears and trying to catalog what led up to this flight. He began thinking, and it always began with a single word. Divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a terrible, ugly word. He hated lawyers who sat in their comfortable chairs with their smiles trying to explain to him in legal terms how all that he lived in was coming apart and the breaking and shattering of all the solid things of his home. Secrets was the word he thought of. No, not secrets so much, just as the secret. What he knew and had not told anyone, what he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn and knew there would be tears. He had cried for a long time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eyes burned. He was very upset. He wiped his eyes, making sure the pilot didn't notice. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw dials, switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles. They were all wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing that he understood, and the pilot seemed the same way, part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit and smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot seat before? He said. He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to come over toward him. Brian shook his head. He'd never been in any kind of plane, never seen the cockpit of a plane except in films or on television. It was loud and confusing. First time. It's not as complicated as it looks. Good plane, like this, almost flies itself, the pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hand on the controls, your feet on the rudder pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I'd better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane moved suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her light. Take her light. Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten by the vibration of the plane. It came through the wheel and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of the wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly and the plane immediately banked to the right. And when he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little, said the pilot. Brian turned the wheel, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around easily. The pilot nodded. All flying is pretty easy. It just takes learning like everything else. Everything else, like the aches and pains of getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window. The burning in his eyes did not come back, but memories did. They all came flooding in. The words, always the words. The secret, fights, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, then the divorce, all so fast. In the summer, Brian would live with his father. In the school year, with his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at papers on the desk. Now, the plane began to lurch slightly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some sort of discomfort. Must have stomach troubles, he said. So this first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation with his father, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed and invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forests ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. It was latched down in the rear of the plane next to a fabric bag that the pilot had called the survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing, something that wouldn't have had to be made very often. The smell began to get worse. There was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot. He found him rubbing his shoulder and down his arm now, his left arm, letting go of more gas and wincing. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick up the drilling equipment. A drive in silence, a long drive in silence, 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out the window, just as he was now, staring out the window of the plane. Once, after an hour, when they were out of the city, she turned to him. Look, we can talk this over. Can't we talk this out? Can't you tell me what's bothering you? And there were the words again. The secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he had remained silent, shook his head, and continued to stare unseeingly at the countryside through the car window. She reached over the back seat and brought up a paper sack. I got something for you, Brian, for your trip. Brian took the sack and opened it up. Inside, there was a hatchet, the kind with a steel handle and a rubber hand grip. The head was in a stout leather case that had a brass riveted belt loop. It goes on your belt, his mother spoke now, without looking at him. There was some farm trucks on the road now, and she had to weave through them and watch traffic. The man at the store said you could use it, in the woods with your father. Dad, he thought? Not my father, my dad. Thanks, it's really nice. But the words sounded hollow, even to Brian. Try it on. See how it looks on your belt.